A Qantas Boeing 747-400 is rapidly rolling down runway 21 left in Bangkok, Thailand. More than 2/3 of the runway is already behind the aircraft, and both pilots are frantically inputting max manual braking, but the aircraft just will not decelerate. Stay tuned. A huge thank you to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. On the surface, this story looks like it's fairly easy to explain, right? It's easy to understand what and who is to blame for what ultimately happened. But it turns out that, once again, this is much more complicated than it looks. And because of that, I'm going to put up a number up here in key moments during this story, which I am then going to explain towards the end of the video. So make sure that you stay tuned to the end to really fully appreciate what led up to this. Qantas Flight 1 is what we refer to now as the kangaroo route. It's the route that Qantas uses to connect Australia via an intermediate stop in Asia to the United Kingdom. And on the 23rd of September 1999, which is when this story happened, the flight started in Sydney, Australia. It then proceeded to Bangkok in Thailand and then onwards towards London in the United Kingdom. The flight was flown by a 747-400, the queen of the sky, one of my absolute favorite aircraft of all time. On board the flight there were 3 pilots, 16 cabin crew and 391 passengers for the first leg, which is when the accident happened. The captain of the flight was a 49-year-old male with 15,881 hours of total time, of which 724 hours was on the 747-400. And part of his experience was also to do what we call base training, which is the touch and go training that you do with pilots that have been recently moved over to a new type before they're allowed to fly with passengers. And this is actually going to become quite important. Flying together with him was also a very experienced first officer. He was a 36-year-old male with 8,973 hours of total time, of which 5,187 was flown on the 747-400. So he was very experienced on the type that he was flying. His training record shows that he was a good pilot with even slightly above average skills. The second officer, who was sitting on the jump seat on the flight, was a 35-year-old male with 6,685 hours of total time, 2,961 hours on the 747-400, and he had previously come from the Australian Air Force, so he was also considered a very experienced pilot. In the cockpit on this flight was also the wife of the second officer, but the fact that she was present in the cockpit is not going to have any kind of bearing on what is about to happen. The first officer was designated pilot flying for the flight, and the initial taxi out, takeoff, climb and cruise towards Bangkok was completely uneventful. Nothing out of the ordinary happened. As the crew started getting closer towards Bangkok, they started getting the weather. And the weather report for Bangkok indicated that there was going to be a 1 of runway 21 left or right for landing. The surface wind was 240 degrees at 10 knots and a visibility of 9 kilometers in rain with thunderstorms in the area. This type of weather is nothing out of the ordinary in Bangkok and Thailand this type of year, because in September they quite frequently get both heavy rains and thunderstorms. So the pilots didn't think that there was anything out of the ordinary. Instead, the first officer had handed over the controls to the captain and started setting up for a ILS approaching for runway 21 right in Bangkok. And they elected to use flaps 25, which is the second highest flap setting for the 747-400, and also idle reverse thrust, which was the company procedure at that time. The aircraft left their cruising altitude, flight level 350, at time 22:16 local time, which meant that it was now completely dark outside. And as they started descending, they very quickly were turned over to the Bangkok area controller. As soon as they switched over the frequency to that new frequency, they were informed that they were number 2 in sequence behind a Thai Airways Airbus A330, and that they were going to land on runway 21 left, not runway 21 right that they had initially prepared for. Runway 21 left is a little bit narrower and also a little bit shorter than runway 21 right, but it's still a very long runway. It's over 3,000 meters long, which is well within the performance capability of the 747-400. Because of the runway change, the first officer now had to rebrief for this new ILS approach, because even though it's for parallel runway, things like minimas, things like the frequencies, and of course performance is going to differ. So he did this new approach briefing, and he pointed out that if they were going to land runway 21 left, they were going to have to roll towards the end of the runway and taxi off on taxiway Sierra, and with that he chose auto brake setting 2, which corresponded to a landing distance that would facilitate a nice taxi off at taxiway Sierra. He also pointed out that runway 21 left had a slightly steeper glide slope than 21 right. So while the standard ILS glide slope sits at 3 degrees, this ILS had a glide slope of 3.15 degrees. The reason this is important is because if the glide slope angle is steeper than normal, it might be more of a problem for the pilot to reduce the speed, and we might have to put the flaps out earlier, and this is why we always include that kind of information in the briefing. But throughout this briefing, there was no discussion about the runway state, as in if this rain that was at the airport was going to have an effect on the braking action. The aircraft continued to descend, and about 4 minutes after the approach briefing was completed, the area air traffic controller informed the aircraft ahead of Qantas 1 that there was now heavy rain at the airport. The captain in Qantas 1 responded to that by selecting auto brake 3 instead, and he said, due to the water. Now this would indicate that he saw a potential problem with a lot of rain on the runway, but there was no further discussion about this. The tower also reported a visibility of 4 kilometers at the airport, and at this time Qantas had a limitation on first officers landing of 1,500 meters, but since 4 kilometers was well above that, there was no need to change the plan. As they were now getting closer, the pilots must have looked down on the weather radar screen and realized that there was quite a lot of thunderstorm activity around the airport. Because the first officers started discussing that in case of a missed approach, they needed to head down to the south to keep clear of the weather. But they were still quite far away, more than 70 kilometers away from the airport at this point. And the thing with thunderstorms is that they move fairly quickly. So even if you have a thunderstorm over the runway, when you're that far away, it might be long gone by the time that you land. At time 22:30, there was a new weather observation made, information uniform and transmitted out on the 80s frequency, which is the automatic broadcast that is sent out. The weather was 240 degrees at 9 knots, visibility 5 kilometers in heavy rain and thunderstorms. This weather report was copied down by the second officer, whose job it was to do this, monitor the weather information, but also to talk to the company and arrange things like buses and whatever else they might need. At time 22:33, the aircraft was now getting so close to the approach that they were handed over to the approach controller. And after this, the crew completed their approach checklist. They reconfirmed that they were going to use flaps 25 and idle reverse thrust during landing. They were now also cleared towards a 10 nautical miles final from a 2-1 left, and as they were getting closer, they now started to reduce the speed to prepare to get the flaps out. They selected flaps 1 and flaps 5, and the aircraft was decelerating normally. At this point, everything looked normal, but what the crew didn't know was that this time, as they were getting ready to intercept the glide slope in towards runway 21 left, there was a special weather observation sent out, information Tango. And in this information, the visibility has now gone down to 1,500 meters in heavy rain, falling to 750 meters. This means that the rain was now getting worse over the runway. But because the crew was never given this information, you have to actively listen out on the 80s frequency in order to get this. And there was no prompt from air traffic control about this new information being available. This was not noticed by the crew. The crew now captured the ILS approach from runway 21 left, and as they did so, they were told by air traffic control that as they passed the outer marker, which is a specific point on the ILS approach, they were to contact Bangkok Tower in order to get landing clearance. Unbeknownst to the crew, they had now become number 3 for landing instead of number 2, which they thought they were. In between them, air traffic control had managed to squeeze in a Boeing 737, which was also a Qantas flight, Qantas 15. Now, as the crew was descending down the glide slope, the Airbus 330 from Thai Airways, which was originally ahead of them, managed to land. But the Qantas 15 flight actually went around as they got into this really heavy rain and lost all visibility at about 350 feet descending on the ILS. Now, the Qantas 1 crew would have heard this if they were actually on the tower frequency, but as they were now descending in and were waiting to pass the outer marker, they were still on the previous frequency, so they did not hear this aircraft going around. The The aircraft is now descending down the glide slope, and the crew can clearly see the runway lights ahead of them. They can see also obviously that there is a rain shower over the approach, but at this point during the approach they are in relatively nice weather with good visibility. So the first officer actually decides to disconnect the autopilot and autothrottle and hand fly the aircraft to get a little bit of hand flying experience, since when you're flying long haul you might not do that very often. At time 22:45, the crew switches over to the tower frequency, and when they speak to the tower tells them that they are clear to land, runway 21 left, but also, caution, runway is wet, and that a previously landed Airbus 330 had reported braking action as good. The tower does not mention that the 737 that is just ahead of them on approach has gone around due to the rain. So this means that the crew are now descending down. They haven't received a special observation. They don't know that the aircraft ahead of them has gone around. And that's important because that might have kind of switched their mind into a potential go-around scenario. The fact that the weather is much worse than what they were expecting it to be. But the crew is completely unaware of this, so they continue the approach. And soon after this, the first officer asks for flaps 25. He gets that from the captain, that's the landing flaps. And after this, he makes remarks and he says, the aircraft doesn't want to slow down. The landing speed that they have selected is a VREF speed of 149 and a fly speed of 154. But at this point, the crew is actually flying about 12 knots faster than that, at 166 knots. The captain acknowledges that the speed is high, but it's still within the stabilized landing criteria, which is VREF to VREF plus 20. So they continue to descend. We can see from the flight data recorder that the thrust is reduced momentarily, but that the first officer doesn't want to reduce it too much, because once you have landing flaps hanging out, you don't want to go back to idle, for example, because the drag of the aircraft and the kind of time it will take for the engines to spool up is too high. So he reduces it, but then kind of sits there, and the speed never really decreases below this 166 knots. At around 350 feet descending, the first officer asks the captain to put the windshield wipers on, as they're now entering some light rain. And as the rain now just becomes heavier and heavier and heavier, the first officer starts to deviate above the glide slope for the first time. The captain points this out, saying, you're getting high now, as he looks out and he can still see the poppies that goes from 3 whites and 1 red, which is the normal that you'll see in a 747, to 4 whites. But he's also aware that they're now so close to the runway that you can't really judge the landing from the poppies anymore. You have to look at the touchdown zone. So as the aircraft descends through 100 feet, the captain asks the first officer, you okay? And the first officer responds with, yes. They're now passing the threshold of the runway at 76 feet, where they should have been at about 50 feet. They're also about 15 knots faster than they should be. But this, even though it is both hot and high, is still well within the manageable range of a 747 coming into such a long runway. At 50 feet, the nose of the aircraft starts coming up, and the captain notices this is quite early, and he says, get it down, you're into the flare. The first officer acknowledges this, but it doesn't really change anything. He just continues to descend with a descent rate of about 300 feet per minute. What he does do is he reduces the thrust back to idle in preparation for the touchdown. Now things are starting to happen really quickly, because as the aircraft, who was already both high and fast over the threshold, is now doing a really slow flare, it means that they're eating up valuable runway below them. And at 30 feet, the captain reaches over and switches the auto brake setting from 3 to 4, indicating that he's well aware that this is now a potential problem. But he doesn't mention that he is doing this to the rest of the crew. There's just no time for it. At 10 feet, the captain announces, go around. The first officer immediately reacts to this by advancing the thrust levers towards go-around thrust and preparing for the go-around. It seems like he was probably awaiting that call. But one thing the first officer does not do is press the toga buttons that would have initiated the flight directors into go-around mode. Because the aircraft is only at 10 feet and because of the enormous inertia of the 747, there's no way that they're not going to touch down. So only a second after this, the aircraft main gear touches down on the runway. And here something very peculiar happens, because it seems like they now get out of the worst part of the rain shower. It means that the visibility is going up drastically. And the captain takes the decision to revert his own go-around decision into a landing decision. He reaches over and puts his hand on top of the first officer's hands and reduces the thrust back to idle again. But by doing so, he actually misses to reduce thrust lever number 1. So that thrust lever is still set towards go-around thrust. The other ones are at idle. And there is a momentary confusion, as you might understand, about who actually has the controls here, because the captain doesn't tell the first officer that he's taken this decision. There are several issues with doing things like this, and I'm going to get into why the captain took this decision and based on what later on in the video. But the immediate effect this has is that as the thrust levels are now being reduced back to idle, the spoilers on the wings does not come up. Okay? Generally speaking, on a normal landing, when the wheels start spinning up and the weight on wheel switches feels that they're on the ground, the spoilers will immediately come up on the wing, and this will force all of the weight of the aircraft down onto the brakes, making the brakes more effective. But since the thrust lever on the engine number 1 is not in idle, it means that the aircraft still thinks that, oh, maybe these guys want to try to go around, so that the spoilers does not come up. But on the other hand, the fact that all of the other 3 thrust levels are reduced back to idle means that the auto brake that was set to 4 just prior to touchdown now switches to disarm instead. So the aircraft is now on the ground, more than 1,000 meters in on the runway. They've already done a very long landing, but they don't have the spoilers up, they don't have the auto brakes working, and there's still a little bit of confusion of what's going on, and engine number 1 is still producing thrust. The first officer says at this point, okay, we're on. And the captain asks, you got it? And the first officer says, yeah. And at this point as well, this is about 2 seconds after the initial touchdown, the first officer reaches over and reduces the thrust back to idle on the remaining number 1 engine, which means that the spoilers are now coming up. Even though the spoilers are up, the engines that were accelerating towards go-around thrust, when you cut the thrust on the engines, it's not like an engine on a car, for example. They will still be accelerating for a while due to the inertia of the fans. So they're still producing forward thrust here. And because there's been this confusion, no one thinks about reaching over and selecting reverse thrust. So the engines, even though they will start to decelerate quickly, they're still producing a forward thrust vector rather than the reverse thrust vector that they would normally have, which would help. Even if it's on idle, it's still better than a forward thrust vector. When the aircraft passes about the midpoint on the runway is where there is a sign on the flight data recorder that the deceleration actually starts. Up in this point, there was actually a small acceleration due to the engines producing forward thrust. The first officer must have noticed that the aircraft is not decelerating at all, so he's putting in max manual braking. But as we were discussing before, up until this point, it's been raining fiercely on the runway. And this runway is not grooved. There are 2 different types of runway. It's either the runway which is grooved, which has little grooves in it, as the name suggests, that lets the water kind of drain out quickly from the runway and leaves a lot of surface for the aircraft tires to kind of grip onto. Or it's the ungrooved surface, which in this case is concrete in Bangkok. And on this type of runway, the runway is a little bit elevated at the center of the runway to allow the water to kind of rinse off, but it takes a longer time. So as the crew is now trying to get max manual braking in, they're actually deviating a little bit to the left of center line. And the flight data recorder shows that as they're now braking, the anti-skid system jumps in almost immediately. And that's most likely because of dynamic aquaplaning. Dynamic aquaplaning is something that's extremely dangerous. The amount of aquaplaning you get has to do with the speed of the aircraft, the tire pressure, and also the grooves in the tires. But if you find yourself in aquaplaning, it's basically like the aircraft goes up on water skis. Okay, it's kind of going on top of the water, removing almost all friction. Okay, it's going to make the braking action for the aircraft essentially poor to nil. And this is what this aircraft is now experiencing. Both pilots are now giving max manual braking, but because the anti-skid system jumps in and make sure that the tires doesn't come to a full stop, the brakes are doing almost nothing. And it's at this point that the use of reversers is the most important thing that you have. But they're not selected. Neither will they be selected at any time during this landing roll. When there is 1,000 meters left of the runway, the speed of the aircraft is still 134 knots, and the aircraft is now slightly left of centerline, and it's likely that because they are not on the centerline and they're moving out toward the edges, that's where there's more water, which actually makes the situation worse. The aircraft passes the opposite threshold at 96 knots. They get beyond the stopway at 88 knots, so that's when they leave the paved part of the runway. And 117 meters later, they run into the localizer antenna, which is sitting on about a meter high concrete foundation. As it does so, the nose wheel collapses, and so does the outer main landing gear on the right-hand side. This causes the nose of the aircraft to dig down into the soft ground, as well as both the engines on the right-hand wing. 103 meters later, the aircraft finally comes to a complete stop with the nose resting on a slightly elevated airport perimeter road. Now, what's about to happen after this is an almost equally interesting story, and I'll tell you all about this after this short message. This video is brought to you together with NordVPN. Now, you know just as well as I do how important it is to protect you and your data in this day and age. I use the NordVPN app whenever I'm out traveling. So if I go into a cafe or an airport and want to use the public Wi-Fi, well then I switch it on and it will tell me whether or not that network is actually safe and secure to use. And if it's not, I just don't use it. It also helps me to encrypt my data and my position, but probably what I use it the most for is to get past these pesky regional restrictions. So if I'm out traveling somewhere and I want to watch my favorite Netflix series, well then by a click of a button I can be back in Spain again, which makes sure that all of the library in Spain is available to me. And you can use up to 6 different devices on one single deal. So if you think, Petter, that sounds great! Well, in that case, go to the video description below, click the link, which is nordvpn.com/pilot, and that will give you a whopping 73% off the 2-year deal, plus an additional 4 months absolutely for free. So go down, click the link, and start protecting yourself on the internet today. So what happened in the back of the cabin then, and after the aircraft came to complete stop? This is a really fascinating story as well. So as the aircraft touched down at time 22:46:30, the purser started the "Welcome to Bangkok" PA, but he very quickly realized that this was not the normal landing, so he stopped that PA. At the same time, some of the other cabin crew down in the back of the aircraft also understood the same and started calling out "brace, brace" and "heads down, grab ankles," the way that they had been trained to do. However, not all cabin crew did this, for reasons unknown. As the aircraft came to a complete stop, in the cockpit, the first officer quickly started his memory items, which included shutting down the engines using the fire switches. At the same time, the captain tried to make a couple of PAs to the passengers. He tried it twice, but it didn't work. And the reason for that was because the nose gear had been pushed into the body of the aircraft and had actually damaged the electronics bay, which is situated just behind the nose gear. And in that electronics bay, the kind of circuit for the PA system and the intercom system was situated. So this meant that not only could the captain not make a PA to the passengers or to the cabin crew, he couldn't even access the intercom system, and neither could the cabin crew, so they couldn't communicate with each other. And this turned out to be a major hurdle. When the captain realized this, he told the second officer to run down and to liaise with the purser, which is the head cabin crew. It's important to understand that the Boeing 747 is a really big aircraft. Okay, it is divided into 6 different zones, which are named A to F, where A to E is on the main deck and F is the upper deck. There are 10 emergency exits on the main deck, and there are 2 emergency exits on the upper deck. There are 16 cabin crew, and to each of these 12 doors, there's 1 cabin crew assigned. And their responsibility, if something like this happens, is to stand by their doors and be ready to evacuate on a very short notice. When the second officer came out and spoke to the purser, you could tell that from as far as they know, there was no fire going on in the cabin and there was no major injuries. So the purser actually left his door unattended and went up with the second officer back into the cockpit. He told the captain that his assessment was that all of the cabin crew was ready to evacuate in case they needed to, and that there was no sign of fire or major injuries in the cabin. The captain took this into consideration when he decided whether or not he was going to evacuate, and based on that decided not to at the moment. As this discussion was going on, the first officer tried to talk to air traffic control. Air traffic control was constantly calling Qantas 1 to see what their status was, because they couldn't see the aircraft from the tower. But anytime that the first officer tried to transmit, he couldn't reach air traffic control, so ATC just kept calling. About 1 minute after the aircraft had gone off the runway, air traffic control got a report from some airport workers that was working in close proximity of where the aircraft went off. And these workers told them what had happened. So ATC pressed the accident button and sent out the emergency equipment towards the runway end. But because it was still raining and the ground was so soggy, the emergency vehicles couldn't actually access the aircraft immediately. They had to turn back and use a perimeter road instead to access the aircraft, and that actually took quite a long time. Now, during this time, the captain told the purser to go back out into the cabin and check throughout the cabin, talk to all the cabin crew and verify the situation. The purser did that, and when he came to about midship over the wings, the cabin crew and the passengers sitting there complained that there was a very foul smell in that area. It smelled like rubber or electrical. He brought that information back to the captain, and the captain then told him to open the overwing exits to ventilate the aircraft. The problem with that, though, is if you want to open the doors to ventilate but not blow the slides, you're going to have to disarm the slides prior to opening, which is what the cabin crew did, effectively rendering those emergency exits non-usable. At the same time, though, in Zone A, which is close to where the damaged nose wheel was, there was more passengers and cabin crew complaining about a really foul odor. And in their case, they actually felt fumes. They had problems breathing and their eyes were watering up. And there was actually an engineer working for Qantas that was sitting in that section that recognized the smell of hydraulic fluid. Unfortunately, that information didn't reach the captain. At time 22:53, this is a full 6 minutes after the aircraft had come to complete stop, the captain finally managed to reach air traffic control via the radio and asked them whether or not the emergency services are coming. Air traffic control tells them that they have already been dispatched and that they should be there momentarily. Now, at the same time, in the back of the aircraft, the passengers are getting really worried. Because remember, during these 6 minutes when they'll be sitting there, the aircraft has turned off the engines, which means that the only lighting they have is the emergency lighting. On top of that, they haven't heard anything from the captain because the PA system is not working. And also, they're getting really annoyed with the cabin crew because they feel that the cabin crew is not doing anything. They're just standing by the doors. What they don't understand is that in a situation like this, the cabin crew's duties goes from being service to safety-minded. Their job is to be standing by their doors to, assess the situation, look for fires, look for the situation outside of the aircraft, to be able to start an evacuation immediately. So, although it's understandable that the passengers felt like this is what you can expect if you find yourself in a situation like this. At time 22:57, the first firefighters arrive at the scene. They pull out their firefighting equipment in case there would be a fire. They also put some floodlight up on the right-hand side of the aircraft, and they start to knock on the side of the aircraft to try to get the attention of the flight crew. Now, that doesn't work, obviously, given the amount of noise that will be going on inside. But the arrival is communicated through traffic control. They also tell them that buses are on the way to take the passengers on. So the captain now decides to start what's called a precautionary disembarkation. Precautionary disembarkation is different than a full evacuation, as in you can use just certain doors, but it's still considered to be an emergency procedure. They decide to use two of the doors on the right-hand side. Because the aircraft is tilted to the right, it means that the slides will have a lesser angle. On the left-hand side, it will be much steeper, and also they have the floodlights on that side, so it'll be easier for the passengers to see. Initially, as the evacuation starts, since they're only using two doors, there are a lot of bottlenecks that are opening up. Some of the passengers are taking their bags with them. Some of the cabin crew actually allows the passengers to take the bags with them. But here's a really important point. Whenever you have to use a slide on an aircraft, you cannot take your bags with you, your hand luggage with you, because you might be hurting other people, you might also be damaging the slides. So under no circumstances should you ever take your bags or hand luggage with you if you're evacuating an aircraft through a slide. Before the disembarkation is complete, there's also a group of cabin crew from Qantas that was supposed to do the outbound flight from Bangkok that arrives at the scene, and they try to gain access to the aircraft to see if they can help with something. This was not seen like a great idea given the fact that they had no idea what was going on inside or what dangers there might be. At time 23:30, almost 43 minutes after the aircraft had come to a complete stop, all passengers, cabin crew and flight crew had vacated the aircraft safely, with only some minor bruises. So now it was time for the air accident investigation to take place. And this actually turns out to be a very good example of why air accident investigations are so critical for the ongoing safety of the airline business. Because when you look at this accident, it looks very clear from the onset who made the mistakes, where the mistakes was made that led up to the eventual accident. But that's not what the air accident investigation is about. Instead, the accident investigation team wanted to know what the root causes were, so that they could go to the bottom of that, making sure that nothing like this happened again. And that's why I have been indicating 6 different points, 6 different critical points during this accident, which the investigation team also kind of drilled into. So let's start with the first one. The base training experience of the captain. So it turns out that this captain was a management pilot. He had been a senior check captain on the Boeing 767, and he was a senior check captain on the Boeing 747-400. And that job came with quite a lot of desk work. Right? It meant that he was flying way less than other pilots were doing. In his job as a base trainer, he would go out and fly with new pilots that were converted onto the type. So he was doing touch and go landings, and in that job, he was very used to having to assess available runway distance, whether or not a touch and go landing was safe to continue or if he had to reject it. So that lay as a foundation to his decision to revert his previous decision to go around into a landing when the visibility suddenly cleared up and he could see that he had almost 2 kilometers of runway left. That turned out to be a bad decision on this occasion, and the investigation team drilled into how much flying experience he actually had during the previous 12 months. And it turned out that it was quite a bit less than other line pilots. And that led up to a recommendation that management pilots should be given more training on an ongoing basis to kind of make up for that lack. The second, and probably the most important point, was the policy that Qantas had at the time, back in 1999, of using flaps 25 as a standard flap setting and idle reverse thrust. This was a decision that was taken in Qantas back in 1997. When the investigation team started looking into it, they saw that there had not been any real risk assessment done in accordance with this policy change. It seemed to have only been based on wanting to reduce noise and drag, which means fuel costs, and also maintenance on the thrust reverser sleeves. Qantas had not been talking to Boeing about this policy change. If they had asked Boeing, Boeing would have said that they did not recommend to use, for example, idle reverse thrust as a standard, because it could lead the pilots into a feeling of not really ever using reversers, and when they actually needed to use them, they wouldn't think of it as a possibility. And this led to a recommendation that Qantas needed to improve their risk assessment before making big policy changes like this. And when the investigation team started looking into why the pilots hadn't decided to use flaps 30 instead, if they knew they were coming into potentially flooded runway, they realized that the pilots weren't really worried about runway flooding as an issue at all. They associated poor braking action with Winthrop's procedures, but not with wet or flooded runways. They didn't even have access to the advisory information in their manuals regarding landing on very wet and flooded runways. And this led to a recommendation of further training being given to the pilots in case they were going to go in and land on these type of runways. Point number 3, why the aircraft didn't want to slow down on final approach. And this is quite an interesting one, because Qantas actually had a monitoring system where they looked for risk parameters that were happening all over the network to see if something was happening that they needed to attend to. And the fact was that the number of approaches which had been carried out slightly high on speed or even too high on speed had increased quite a lot, around 35%, when the change was made to the flap policy to use flaps 25 rather than flaps 30. The pilots said that the 747 was easier to handle speed-wise with flaps 30, but since the policy was now to use flaps 25 as a standard flap, this had started to happen. So those figures were available to Qantas, but they hadn't been highlighted. And all of this brought together, this led to Qantas actually abandoning the standard flaps 25 and idle reverse policy. Point number 4, the captain's decision to revert his go-around decision to a landing decision, we've already touched on a little bit. It had to do with the captain's previous experience as a base training captain, but it also highlighted the importance of communication intra-cockpit to make sure that whatever decision has been taken is very clearly communicated between all 3 pilots in this case, so that no ambiguity exists of whether or not they're in a go-around or in a landing. This confusion probably led to the first officer completely missing that he hadn't selected reverse thrust at all. It's even possible that his movement of the thrust lever number 1 back to idle might have translated into him thinking that he had taken reverse thrust even though he hadn't done it because of the stress of the situation. So that also led to some recommendations regarding crew resource management, CRM. Point number 5, communication after the aircraft came to a stop. The air accident investigation team very quickly realized that the fact that the nose gear had collapsed inwards and damaged the circuitry that had to do with the PA system and the cabin intercom system had a really severe impact on the communication between the crew in this big aircraft. So a recommendation was made to Boeing to make a redundant system which was not reliant on 2 components sitting in the same position behind the nose wheel, which was sure to be damaged in any type of overrun accident like this. They also recommended to the Australian authorities and to Qantas to install loud hailers in the aircraft, because this was actually a requirement in America and in Europe, but it wasn't a requirement in Australia at the time. And it would have helped in case this would have developed into a full-blown evacuation. And last but not least, number 6, the decision not to evacuate. So the captain was asked why he decided not to evacuate the aircraft immediately, even though he knew that the aircraft had gone off and that it was probably damaged. The captain said that he based that decision on the fact that there was no reports of any fires. He knew that in case he started an evacuation, there would be people who would hurt themselves as part of the evacuation. He also knew that it was rainy and dark outside, and if he started evacuating before they had any emergency equipment outside, it was a possibility that the passengers might start moving towards the only light they could see, which would be the terminal building, and that would mean that they would go into a potentially active runway, which was runway 21 right in Bangkok. So he had a full thought process involved here. Now, if he had been made aware of the fumes in the forward part of the aircraft, he might have started evacuation anyway. But given the information that he had because of the problems of communicating in the aircraft, he based his decision on the overall safety for as many people as possible. And it turned out that that was a correct decision to make after disembarkation. So what looks as something that doesn't make any kind of sense when you look at it at a glance might make much more sense when you actually dig into it, which is what an air accident investigation is supposed to do. If you want to check out another video where the aircraft started accelerating uncontrollably after landing, well then, check out this video up here. Or if you just want to binge watch air accident investigation videos, I've got just a playlist for you up here. Before you go, remember the acronym CLASS. I want you to report CLASS complete in the comment section below. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.